Hi guys, welcome to China Perspective. My name is 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗵 and you may know me as a German recruiter in Asia. Today I want to share some details of the China labor law with you, and I guarantee you some of them will be a shock. There are actually many misconceptions about the China labor market. In the news, we often hear of almost slave-like working cultures. We hear of bathroom time being reduced to the minimum, hours of unpaid overtime. But if you think China is just about the 996 culture, which means working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. at 6 days a week and exploiting its employees, you may be surprised. So while that does exist in some places and is an uncomfortable reality for some people, it's been much more a thing in the past. We all remember the horrendous suicide nets at Foxconn to prevent utterly exhausted workers from self-harm, but many things have changed. In fact, you may be surprised about the reality on the ground, especially for Western companies and especially in larger cities, which tend to follow legal regulations much more closely than smaller private companies or in smaller cities far away from the big ones. But in many cases, in fact, China's labor law are way more employee-friendly than in the West. Especially if you're from the US, you may be surprised about what I'm going to tell you. So in this video, let's look at the 5 most shocking facts about the labor law in China. Surprising law number 1. Let's talk about motherhood protection, which is probably one of the most surprising aspects of China's labor law to people outside of the country. In most countries, maternity leave and pregnancy rights vary widely. In Germany, that's where I'm from, for example, the protection is quite high. In the United States, for example, it is quite low. In China, with the past context of the one-child policy, which has long since been abolished, one may assume there was no need for extensive maternity rights, right? But in China, once a woman announces her pregnancy to her employer, she is protected from dismissal. And not only during her pregnancy, but for 12 whole months after the date that she gave birth. The 12 months after giving birth are referred to as the nursing period, and she cannot be fired during this time. Now about maternity leave. China guarantees 98 days of paid leave for mothers, which is already a pretty solid benefit. But in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai, if the mother is over 35 or it's a second child or if it's a risk pregnancy, something that doctors say quite often, the government even gives more leaves. I would say that the maternity leave I see around me on average is about somewhere between 5 to 6 months. And here's the extra benefit. Maternity is often paid with 70 to 100% of the employee's last 12 months average salary, and it's paid by the government as well as the social insurances that they contribute to. Compare that to countries like the US, which has no federal paid maternity leave. So in reality, yes, due to this generous law, we see some recruiting bias against young or newly married women. This is more pronounced in a slow economy like now than it is in an economy that is growing fast. But at the same time, the reality is that the absolute large majority of women do return back to the office after the maternity leave. I would guesstimate that around 90% of mothers work, as usually their family helps with child rearing. That is great for companies and avoids the dreaded maternity career dip for mothers that we see in other countries, which are struggling with providing proper childcare access and affordability. There are also some companies who try to avoid paying. But as said, these tend to be smaller, these tend to be local, and these tend to be in smaller cities. If you're a Western firm in Shanghai or Beijing, the chance of you cutting corner and getting away with it are low to very low, and I really don't recommend it. Surprising law number 2, severance pay. The employer always pays. So next we're talking about the severance pay, which is something you don't always see in Western countries. But in China, it's pretty much guaranteed. So severance is money an employee receives when the employer, the company, ends the working relationship. But the employee does not receive it when they themselves resign, for example, to go to work in another company. But it means if you are fired or if your contract is not renewed, you still get severance. Yeah, you heard me right. Even if the company decides to not continue your contract or decides to let you go, they're legally obligated to pay you. Most contracts in China are time limited, on average 3 years. This can be extended once before it becomes an open-ended contract. So if the company decides to not renew your contract after the first 3 years, they still have to pay you. How much? That's a big question. It's pretty generous, to be honest. Severance payments are usually calculated something like this. You get 1 month's salary per year that you worked, and if the dismissal is deemed unfair, it goes up to 2 months per 1 year. Legally, it is quite a high bar to dismiss someone fairly. There's a long process that needs to be met, from low performance to an official warning letter to an opportunity to improve and maybe even the chance to do different work in the same firm. It's quite difficult, to be honest, with all the burden of proof on the employer. There's also a cap on the severance. Usually it is 3 times the city's average salary, but in many cases employees actually can get more. So even if a company decides to part ways with an employee, they still have to pay a decent sum to make sure the separation is smooth. Surprising law number 3. Let's talk about non-compete clauses. These are a huge deal in many countries where employees are often bound by quite restrictive non-compete agreements. But in China, these agreements are highly regulated and much more employee-friendly than you may think. For starters, non-competes cannot be more than 2 years. That's a huge difference compared to some other countries where they can last indefinitely. Second, the geography of these clauses is very strictly limited. So an employer can't say, you can't work anywhere in this country. No, they must be specific to a region. For example, if you worked in Beijing, that clause can only cover that city, not the region, not the entire nation. But here's also an interesting part. If a company enforces a non-compete, they have to pay the employee. And yeah, that's right. They are required by law to compensate the employee with somewhere between 30 to 50% of the salary during the duration of the non-compete period. That means a firm would have to pay the employee this amount, even if the employee has left the company. It is a huge cost burden. Without payment, the non-compete clause is invalid. But the employee cannot take another job during this time either. This makes non-competes in China not nearly as powerful as in other parts of the world, and often they end up being not enforceable. I personally really still recommend you as a company to sign them with your key stuff. If nothing else, it will help as an emotional reinforcement to keep your data confidential. Surprising law number 4, employee legal protections. Did you know that in China an employee can sue their employer up to 12 months after leaving their job? That's right. So if an employee feels they have been wronged, they have 12 months to take action, and labor courts are free or very, very, very cheap for employees to use. The government even provides legal support if the employee needs it. But it gets even more challenging. The burden of proof is on the employer. So if an employee claims they've been wrongfully dismissed or they weren't paid properly or anything else, the employer has to prove that they didn't violate the law. A company needs a lawyer to represent them, and all communication needs to be in Chinese. It's quite expensive for companies to go through this process, and in reality, many just come to a kind of agreement. Also, in many cases, judges really strongly encourage financial settlements to avoid dragging the case through the very long and expensive court battles. It is also preferred for their statistics, as cases with a settlement are in a different statistic, and that just overall looks better and much more harmonious. So companies often end up settling for much more than they expected, just to keep things from escalating. Surprising law number 5, overtime laws. China in general is a very hardworking culture, which also includes working hours and hours with not so many leave days. Everybody knows that overtime can be a huge issue in many workplaces, especially in China's infamous 996 culture. But did you know that China has strict laws to protect employees when it comes to overtime work? Under Chinese labor law, overtime hours are highly regulated. For example, you cannot work more than 3 hours extra per day, and you can't exceed 36 hours of overtime per month. And when employees do overtime, they're legally entitled to extra pay. For example, 150% of their salary for overtime on weekdays, 200% on weekends, and a whopping 300% on official public holidays. So while 996 might be in reality in some industries, the law ensures that employees get compensated fairly for those long hours, at least in theory. And in fact, many companies end up paying out huge sums to workers who put in overtime, especially when they didn't follow the overtime rules. That being said, employees cannot just stay longer at their table or stay longer in the office and get compensated for it. They have to follow a process to apply for overtime. They apply in writing and note what they will do and why, and it needs to be confirmed in writing for management to actually qualify. What we see, especially with blue-collar workers, is that they want to work as much overtime as possible to increase their pay a lot. So it is not unheard of that blue-collar workers go on strike to get more overtime than the allotted 36 hours, or they start working really slowly to show to the management that they need more overtime. If that happens to you as a company, you are a little bit between a rock and a hard place. The best course of action you can take is to have your legal team talk to your city or district government and explain the situation, and they will most likely give you a green light to let the people work longer than stipulated by law. Local government in general prefer hands-on solutions that keep social harmonies and keep workers happy and will work together with you. And there you have it, 5 surprising labor law facts in China that you may have not known about. So while the conditions in some sectors may not always be ideal, China's labor laws are surprisingly pro-employee in many ways. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this video useful, like and subscribe for more, and see you in the next video. Bye guys!